They laughed at my ugly concrete wall. They fined me. They threatened to sue me. But the night the storm rolled in and their $1 million mansions started filling like swimming pools, guess who was standing dry and smiling? If you love stories where karma shows up with thunder and lightning, hit subscribe right now, because this one is unforgettable. I never planned on becoming the villain of Maple Ridge Estates, but apparently pouring reinforced concrete along your own legally surveyed property line qualifies as an act of war when your neighbors prefer manicured hedges and champagne fundraisers to common sense. Maple Ridge was one of those lakeside communities where every mailbox matched, every lawn was cut at precisely 3 inches, and every resident pretended natural disasters were something that happened to other zip codes. I had moved there 5 years earlier after selling my contracting business, thinking I'd earn some peace and quiet. What I didn't expect was that the same lake view that sold me on the property would slowly become the source of my neighbor's arrogance and my future vindication. The first 2 years were calm enough, but I noticed something most of them ignored: the waterline crept higher every spring. Storms were getting meaner. Drainage ditches overflowed faster. Twice I watched the shoreline swallow 10 more inches of grass like a patient predator. I had spent 30 years building foundations. I understood soil saturation and runoff better than any HOA board member who thought French drains were a type of pastry. So when the county released a quiet advisory about increased flood risk due to upstream development and heavier rainfall patterns, I didn't scoff, I got to work. I hired a surveyor, confirmed my boundaries, and drafted plans for a 4-foot reinforced concrete flood wall along the lakeside edge of my property, tied into a subsurface footing that went down nearly 3 feet with drainage weep holes engineered to relieve hydrostatic pressure. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to stand between my home and a wall of water. When construction began, that's when the mockery started. Sandra Whitmore from 3 houses down, queen of the HOA, platinum bob haircut sharp enough to cut glass, was the first to show up with her clipboard and condescension. She stood there watching the rebar go in like I was building a prison camp. "It looks industrial," she said, nose wrinkled. "This is a residential aesthetic community." I told her I preferred dry drywall over aesthetic harmony. She didn't laugh. Within a week I received my first violation notice: unsightly structure inconsistent with neighborhood character. The fine was $500, escalating weekly. I attended the next HOA meeting, armed with engineering reports, floodplain maps, and photographs of past overflows. They barely glanced at them. The board voted 4-1 to demand removal within 30 days. They said the wall would obstruct the lake view and reduce property values. I countered that water in the living room would do worse. They smirked. One neighbor, Greg Halston, the guy who installed a heated driveway so snow wouldn't inconvenience his Tesla, actually chuckled and said, "If the lake ever rises that high, we'll all have bigger problems." That line stuck with me. Bigger problems. They fined me again when I refused to tear it down. They sent certified letters. They hired a lawyer to threaten a lien. I hired one back. It became a standoff. I paid the fines into escrow and filed an injunction, arguing my right to protective improvements within my boundary. The case dragged. Meanwhile, I finished the wall. Smooth gray concrete, capped neatly, integrated with landscaping on my side. On their side, it looked like a fortress. That's what they called it. His bunker. The Berlin Wall. I overheard them at the annual block barbecue making jokes about how I was preparing for the apocalypse. I smiled and flipped burgers. Because here's the thing. I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being right. The summer passed quietly, but meteorologists began using phrases like record-breaking system and historic rainfall when discussing the tropical remnants tracking inland toward our state. Sandra posted in the neighborhood group chat that the storm would fizzle out, like they always did. The county issued a flood watch. Then a warning. Then mandatory sandbag distribution points opened. I drove down to watch the lake the evening before landfall. The wind already clawed at the surface, turning it from glass to muscle. The sky looked bruised. I went home, checked my sump pumps, tested my generator, and stood for a moment behind my wall, hand resting on cool concrete, wondering if it would hold. The storm hit after midnight. Rain didn't fall, it attacked. Sheets of water pounded roofs and carved rivers through lawns. By 2 a.m., the lake had risen past the dock posts. By 3 a.m., I heard sirens. I stepped onto my back patio with a flashlight and watched the unimaginable unfold. Water surged across the common greenbelt like a charging animal and slammed against the properties in a single rolling front. It hit my wall first. The impact shook the ground, but the footing held. Water climbed the lakeside, pressing hard, searching for weakness. It spilled around the ends toward neighboring yards, yards with decorative stone edging and shallow retaining walls that had never been meant for force. Within minutes, their patios disappeared. I saw Greg's heated driveway vanish under brown current. Patio furniture floated like toys. Someone screamed. The surge deepened. The lake had effectively annexed Maple Ridge. My wall redirected the worst of the force along its length, channeling it sideways where there was no barrier. That's when I understood something ugly. Protection isn't neutral, it changes outcomes. My yard remained soaked but intact, water level stopping inches below the capstone. On the other side of the wall, chaos multiplied. Basement windows imploded. Garage doors buckled inward. I watched headlights flicker underwater as cars filled silently. The storm lasted 6 hours. By dawn, Maple Ridge Estates looked like a marina without boats. Mansions had become swimming pools. Rescue teams arrived with inflatable craft, navigating streets that had transformed into canals. I helped pull 2 elderly neighbors from a second-floor balcony using a ladder braced against my wall. Irony didn't taste sweet, it tasted heavy. But I would be lying if I said I didn't remember every laugh at my expense. Sandra's house suffered the worst. Without any barrier, the lake poured straight through her glass back doors. I later learned water reached nearly 5 feet inside. Hardwood floors warped like potato chips. Her designer kitchen swelled and split. Insurance adjusters used words like, total loss. By afternoon the storm passed, leaving a silence broken only by generators and distant helicopters. I walked the length of my wall. Minor cracks in surface plaster. Nothing structural. It had done its job. Over the next week, reality settled in like mold. The HOA clubhouse was unusable. 43 homes reported catastrophic damage. Mold remediation crews replaced landscapers. The group chat turned from sarcasm to desperation. And then came the emergency meeting. They held it in the one dry corner of the community center. Sandra looked 10 years older. The agenda item read, Community Flood Mitigation Solutions. When they opened the floor, Greg stood up, same man who joked about bigger problems, and asked if I would share the specs of my wall. The room turned toward me not with ridicule, but with something close to humility. I explained footing depth, rebar grid, expansion joints, drainage allowances. I explained cost, less than what most of them spent on patio renovations. A silence followed that felt like swallowing pride collectively. But the twist came 2 days later when I received another certified letter. Not an apology, a notice. The HOA claimed my wall had diverted floodwaters and increased damage to adjacent properties. They were exploring legal action for nuisance and redirection liability. I stared at the paper, stunned at the audacity. They had mocked me for building it. Now they blamed me for it working. My attorney nearly laughed out loud when I showed him. If a storm surge overwhelms unprotected property, he said, that's called physics, not nuisance. We prepared anyway. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. County engineers conducted their post-disaster assessment and requested access to inspect my structure. They measured, documented, photographed. 2 weeks later, during a public briefing, they referenced one private mitigation installation within Maple Ridge Estates that significantly reduced property damage. They recommended similar barriers along vulnerable lakefront segments. News crews picked up the story. Suddenly my ugly wall was featured in interviews as an example of proactive resilience. The narrative shifted. Residents from neighboring communities asked for contractor referrals. The HOA's legal threat quietly evaporated when their own insurer hinted that pursuing it might complicate claims. Sandra knocked on my door one evening, not with a clipboard but with a pie that looked store-bought and an expression I had never seen on her face, uncertainty. She said, we should have listened. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close enough. Over the following months, Maple Ridge underwent reconstruction. But this time, change came with concrete and steel. A coordinated flood barrier system was approved, ironically based almost entirely on my design. The HOA amended architectural guidelines to allow protective structures. They even asked if I would consult on placement to avoid water displacement conflicts. I agreed, on one condition: no fines for aesthetic violations when safety was involved. The motion passed unanimously. The next storm season arrived quieter, but we were ready. A continuous reinforced barrier now lined the lakefront, landscaped thoughtfully but uncompromising in strength. Insurance premiums stabilized. Property values recovered faster than predicted because buyers saw protection instead of vulnerability. And the nickname, Berlin Wall, faded into the line that saved us. The real twist, though, wasn't structural, it was social. People stopped treating preparedness like paranoia. They asked questions before mocking ideas. They voted differently in meetings. They learned the cost of arrogance. As for me, I still stand on that concrete cap during heavy rain sometimes, listening to water push and slide along its face. It reminds me that being unpopular is a small price to pay for being prepared. They fined me for protecting my home. They laughed at the gray slab that interrupted their sunset photos. But when the lake rose like a fist and turned luxury into liability, that ugly wall became the difference between inconvenience and ruin. And if there's one thing Maple Ridge Estates will never forget, it's this: nature doesn't care about aesthetics, and neither does karma.